we're in the final straight now. We're going to start with a legal charter. We're then going to look at importing aircraft into Europe. We've got a fantastic broker panel. David Hernandez is going to moderate with David Dixon and Mike Dwyer. And then we're going to look at Korea, Japan, and finance. We're absolutely delighted to have Peter Coles of HFW, Peter's partner in the Hong Kong office, where he gets involved in a lot of litigation. And we're going to hand over to Peter now.
Thank you very much, Al, for this opportunity. I'm interested that, there was a recent email exchange between ASBA members in Hong Kong, particularly people at a very senior level, and the individuals who actually requested a prioritization of subjects to discuss with Hong Kong CAD. There were two of them in particular wanted to discuss illegal charters, and they are here in Singapore, but they're not in the audience this afternoon. That may be because they know more about this subject than I do. I had a bit of a moment at 3 a.m. this morning when I was called by an owner of an aircraft in relation to a disturbing issue which I'm going to deal with in the context of the presentation. That is one of human trafficking. There are going to be some subtopics or some comments that I'm going to make about some of the more dubious aspects that go on in this industry. I do so with some trepidation. There's a gentleman over here who is staring at me keenly. I'm wondering whether he's a prosecutor. But I do have a habit of being quite outspoken, but like Paul Jebley, I might plead the fifth, although I'm not a US lawyer. But in terms of the moment, I decided just after this call I received early this morning that I would do away with my slides because they don't naturally flow together. That's my fault. But I'm just going to put up one slide. Now you'll get the slide stack whenever it's available from CJI. But of course, in changing the format of my presentation, I've had to rewrite my the talk that I was going to give you. So I'm afraid I've got some notes, and I am going to have to talk to them. But if you can't hear me, just shout. And if you don't like anything I'm saying, just shout or put one of those abusive text messages up onto the screen. So I'm going to discuss illegal charters in the broadest sense of those two words. Of course, a primary focus of attention is that of grey charters, whether or not you believe in that phrase. Some people think it's a misnomer, but I'm not just going to be talking about the issue about seemingly private flights operating as commercial flights, but that is an important part. I'm going to be also drawing some examples of other types of illegal flights and illegal charters, because I think it's important. I will then go on, as requested by Al, to look at what customers should look for in spotting illegal charters. Do we have any customers here? Are you a customer? Okay. So I think given the audience, I'm also going to have to talk about what should be the concerns of operators, owners and managers, other than the primary concern for you of losing out on revenue. Now, the press, Al, usually get very excited about grey charters at the time of business aviation shows and conferences. Have you thought about how many press articles you see between those conferences on grey charters? And I had a look at this, and I don't have statistics to give you, but it is interesting how you have this huge peak around conference time, and then it appears in one sense, particularly in this part of the world, as opposed to Europe or North America, that nothing is being said or being done. That may be unfair, but I do think we have a long way to go in the Asia-Pacific region before we get to the levels of understanding, the levels of appreciation, the levels of containment, and in some cases enforcement, where illegal charters are arising. So as an action item, Al, I want CJI to, whether it's your 1 minute week or whether it's some other news item, to have more frequent discussions throughout the year on these issues. So what are grey charters? Al said before you all came in that I don't like that word. I have an indifference towards the use of the phrase grey charters. Some say there is no such thing. A flight is either legal or it's illegal. And I could ask you to say what you think, but I don't think we have time. But I don't think it's actually that simple. As an aviation lawyer, when we deal with a dispute, or whether we deal with an occurrence or an event, or where we're dealing with a new operation, we tend to think of mother regulations first. So we're not looking at the national laws that apply at the state registry, or laws that might exist between the various countries in which these flights may operate, or domestically. We look at mother regulations. Where are the mother regulations? They are at ICAO level. If you look at Annex 6, that deals with Annex 6 to the Chicago Convention, which deals with flight operations, does it have a definition for private flights? No. Does it have a definition for public transport flights? No. Does it have a definition for commercial air transport flights? Yes. Okay? And that definition is very simply that flights are being operated for reward or potentially valuable consideration, which may not be actually money. It can be some sort of other property or exchange. So at the mother level, we don't have much to guide us. So if you've got a group of 6 or 7 people on a business flight, Part 91 operation, and they're contributing to the cost of the flight, is that private or is it something else? So if the international framework cannot assist us, and if it can't, by the way, that's the fault of all member states and their governments, where do you look? National law. And when you look at national law, you see that there is some greater clarification in certain countries. So Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, Europe. And then when you look wider afield, it all becomes a bit murky. And as I said to Mike just now, if it was all black and white, you wouldn't need lawyers. But unfortunately, you do. To give you an example, in Hong Kong, an aircraft is deemed to fly for the purpose of public transport if there is higher or reward or valuable consideration. Where did that come from? That came from the Air Navigation Order in the United Kingdom. Now, in 2009, the UK CAA, recognizing there was a problem, issued guidelines to operators, to owners, the general public, available through their website, on what flights would be commercial air transport, which is a European idea, it's not a British idea, what flights would be public transport, what would be private, purely private, and what sort of payments might bring a private operation into public transportation. And those guidance notes also specify certain permitted exemptions. So let's get back to Hong Kong, because a lot of Hong Kong law is based on English law. What does the Hong Kong CAD provide by way of guidance? Well, I haven't seen any. There may be people here who have. But it's interesting that in one of the chapters to CAD 360, it states, I quote, operators should seek legal advice on whether they can operate flights without an AOC. That's really helpful, isn't it? Now let me just take that a little bit further. So you should seek legal advice. So you go to a lawyer and say, will my flight actually be a flight where I need an AOC, or will it be something else? So what lawyers will typically do is if it's a territory that belonged to another country at some point in time, they look back to that country. But as we've seen involving in Hong Kong, increasingly Hong Kong does not rely upon guidance from the UK, doesn't rely upon guidance from anyone else. So when you look at it, you're actually going in a vicious circle. The regulator is saying, well, we're not going to give you guidance, so go and see a lawyer. And a lawyer is finding it very hard to actually specify what the law should actually be. It's stupid, it's daft, it needs to change. Even in more sophisticated countries like the United States, it is said that people and organizations are struggling with what are the appropriate ownership structures. And we see article after article after article coming out from lawyers, from commentators and observers. So there's a real issue there. And more recently, there's a growing concern in terms of flight cost sharing apps. And I'll return to the issue of apps later on if I have time. Now, I'm going to move away from grey charters and just talk about other examples of illegal operations which may, of course, involve a charter element. And, of course, this isn't a comprehensive list, and you can think of your own examples. But here are some in the last 5 years that I've seen. A business jet operating in Indonesia with 2 pilots who didn't even have a PPL, let alone a CPL, performing air transport flights. An operation operating flights without traffic rights. This is in the Caribbean. A business jet owner knowing that the aircraft was being used on a regular basis for scheduled operations between 2 countries. The aircraft actually crashed. It killed people. It raised a whole host of issues. But one thing that was clear in the minds of the court was that this was really an airline operation. And to be an airline operation, you need not only an AOC, but you needed to be designated as a designated airline by the 2 states, party to an air service arrangement. And once you had been designated, you needed an operating permit in both of those countries. And then, because of that, tariff filing, your pricing was all determined by the regulator. And of course, none of that happened. That operation was in complete breach of numerous regulations. What else have we seen? We've seen business jets being used for transporting arms shipments from North Korea to Myanmar and other favorable holiday destinations. These flights were said to be holiday flights for private owners. They weren't. It led to a dawn raid in a warehouse in Myanmar against a very large logistics company that I cannot name, and there had been ongoing flights between these 2 countries. We've seen flights into sanctioned countries, so they shouldn't be there, usually because insurance is not available for those countries. More recently, this is in the last 7 weeks, become aware of a charter involving a mapping company that chartered a business jet to perform low-altitude flights in restricted airspace. They modified the hull in order to install specialist camera equipment. The observers on board that aircraft, who were there to monitor the equipment to ensure that it was operating properly and directing the crew what to do, so there's an issue here of operational control, and for good measure allowed friends and family onto those flights for a notional fee. They were not permitted to modify that aircraft without approval. They were not permitted to fly air transportation flights. They were not permitted to operate at those altitudes. And they were certainly not permitted to operate in restricted airspace. These things happen. I'm coming back to my human trafficking case. Those of us who also work in the airline market know that human trafficking is a huge topic today because of the potential fines that exist if an airline or an airport or a ground handler are caught being involved in human trafficking or simply turning a blind eye. In 2008, a child prostitution ring, which was using business jets in this part of the world, was busted. That was not a case of human trafficking. Under 16-year-old children would be used for pleasure on those business flights. It's a small miracle that this was discovered and stopped. And then there was the case of the Margot convoy, 9 consecutive large business jets operating the same day into 3 cities in China, carrying large quantities of Margot. Why? To beat import taxes. These things happen. Now, you're probably all familiar with these 2 pictures. The one on the left-hand side being the 40 million pound drug seizure, 26 Samsonite cases, 700 kilograms. This aircraft was owned by a French tycoon. During downtimes, it was chartered out, and he was not aware of what was actually happening. The aircraft got seized, confiscated. There were insurance coverage-related issues and the like. And then on the right, the Platinum Jet story. How many of you can remember the Platinum Jet story? It's great. There should be a Hollywood movie, right? And if we're not going to have a Hollywood movie, let's at least have an educational video that is produced, that talks about this story. Every time I look at this story, I establish more information. And it's just fascinating what happened in that case. So that particular accident, there were 8 employees of an investment fund intending to travel, should I say, from New Jersey to Chicago. According to the captain, who was quite badly injured as he got out of the aircraft, he swore to the FAA that this was a Part 91 operation, and indeed the manifest said so. None of the passengers were actually seriously injured, but both pilots were injured. There were other problems with this. So there was no AOC. They've been operating these jets on a regular basis. There were complicated arrangements in play. Sometimes it was their jets, sometimes it was someone else's jets. There are multiple charter brokers involved. It's all very confusing. But also because Platinum Jets was actually owned by foreign ownership, this flight was operating a cabotage flight and therefore in breach of traffic rights. You may remember that the FAA was severely criticized for their poor oversight by the NTSB. But it's not easy for the FAA, who at the time were only looking at paper documents, and there's often a very long, muddy trail as to who's actually involved in these operations. The fines imposed upon Platinum Jet and their owners were tiny. I think it was $75,000 for the owners, $150,000 for the company. That is not a deterrent, ladies and gentlemen. We need millions and millions and millions of dollars of fines to stop this kind of behavior. Now, I'm not sure about the prevalence of grey charters in the industry. You guys and ladies will know more about that than me. There were a lot of stats coming out in 2015, 2014, again around business aviation conferences, one in Europe and one in the Middle East. But there were figures like this: 7% of all business flights in Europe were illegal. They were grey charters, 25% in the Middle East, 99% in Russia, almost all operators in India. Now we come to June 2018, and I'm going to start with June and I'm going to go back to May, because May is important. So in June 2018, this month that we're in now, Evershed Sutherland, which is an English-US law firm, said, a large percentage of US business flights in the United States violate US law. So we haven't really learnt, if they're right, we haven't really learnt much. as an industry since events like Platinum Jet. And of course, there have been other accidents. Now, in May this year, 3 industry associations, 2 in Europe, 1 in the United States, talked about essentially 2 things. 1, setting up a joint reporting mechanism to gather together a body of evidence. Gather together a body of evidence. Think about that. And the other one is to provide guidance, working with the FAA and Congress. And I think these are great initiatives, but I just want to deal with the body of evidence point. Guidance is one thing, data collection is another. We all know about data collection issues now, particularly in a European context. How is this data to be collected? Where is it going to be obtained from? How is it to be analyzed? How is it going to be verified? To what rules is it going to be verified? How is it going to be stored? How is it going to be disseminated? Is this a mechanism by which you're going to hand over the body of evidence to an authority? Is the authority going to listen? And this sort of reminds me of confidential reporting in the industry, which is really to do with safety. Confidential reporting doesn't exist, really. It doesn't really exist. There are very few countries in the world, I think there's really only 2, that ensure that confidential reports in a safety context are that. And I think that's Denmark and Holland. No other countries, because confidential reports or the body of evidence will be subject to inspection by judicial authorities, prosecutors, plaintiff lawyers, and other interested parties. So my next action point, not directed at Al, but to everyone else, is what are you going to do with this body of evidence? What are you going to do with it, and how are you going to collect it? Now, why should charter customers worry about any of this? And of course, the primary issue is one of safety. Flights, obviously subject to an AOC, have higher regulatory standards to meet, whether it be relating to aircraft maintenance, whether it be relating to crew, engineers, managers of operations. There are, of course, greater insurance requirements, and there are other issues. There's also the issue of reputation, though, isn't there? So if you think about Platinum Jet, there were senior leaders of very large American insurance companies, investment fund managers, and film stars who used those flights. So to be associated with the skullduggery that took place by Platinum Jet and others that have sadly followed is not good for you. It's not good for business. And in my view, operators and managers who comply with the law but are based or working in a locality where others are not are, I wouldn't say they are as guilty, but the fact is that particularly when it comes to criminal conduct or corporate governance issues are to a certain extent as blameworthy as those that don't comply with the law. And in fact, when you look at criminal conduct, ignorance generally is not a defense any longer. Acquiescence is not a defense, and turning a blind eye is not a defense. What should you as operators and owners and managers worry about? Well, there is the prosecution element, and as we heard earlier this morning, you cannot purchase insurance to pay for fines or your time imprisonment. You can purchase certain types of insurance that will assist you in a criminal investigation, may assist you in providing bail money to get people out of country, but of course you have to repay it if it's later found out that you have committed a criminal offense. It's very often the case in more civil countries, civilized countries, more modern countries, that when a judge is hearing a case about the loss of life or serious property damage, that in addition to convicting an individual, a controlling mind, a director, at that same sentencing hearing, they can disbar you from public life. What does that mean? You can no longer be a director in that jurisdiction. You can no longer set up a company. And some of those orders are for life, some of them are for shorter durations. I go back to the Caribbean crash because there's a difference in the liability regime that applies depending on whether you're flying a private flight operation or a public or commercial flight. My colleague Mert said, he made a comment that the Montreal Convention of 1999 applies to gratuitous carriage. That is actually only the case if it's a public air transport undertaking performing the flight. But in substance, he is right. But in that Caribbean case, the owners thought that their liability would be determined by allegations of breach of contract or negligence. And that wasn't actually the case because international air law will intervene if it is public air transportation or commercial air transport situation. And what that means is that there is a presumption of liability. It's almost akin to strict liability. Nobody needs to prove that the operator, the owner and manager of the aircraft, has committed a tort, so negligence. You don't have to prove breach of contract. You are automatically liable up to a certain value of money. And when you take into consideration average fatal accident awards for, say, Americans who can very often get into court in the United States, you're looking at about $5 million per person. Okay, so you're carrying 10, that's quite a lot of money. 10 people, that's quite a lot of money. Is the insurance that you buy, does it permit commercial flights? Because if it doesn't, you're in dead trouble. How many corporations can actually afford tens of millions of dollars in potential liability? And those are just awards before you get into the issue of legal fees. Now, of course, illegal operations may also be a breach of aircraft finance and lease terms. We could spend a whole day talking about seizures, returns, confiscations. We were involved in a business jet that was confiscated in Russia. It's still there, I think, 10 years after the event. So how do you spot illegal charters? Do you know, I've never flown on a business jet. I've flown on pretty much every other aircraft you can think of. But Mike Walsh, I don't know why you raised this, but at lunchtime you raised the issue of the Japanese tsunami, Fukushima plants. And it reminded me of something, which was, I had to go to a legal conference in Kyoto that year. There were going to be 33,000 lawyers. Great place to kill all the lawyers on earth. And I was hosting an aviation section, and the actual number of lawyers who turned up was 700. You know, lawyers, they talk a good game, but they're scared like shit when it comes to something like that kind of an occurrence. But I only agreed to carry on chairing this session after I spoke to the municipal government in Kyoto. And I wanted assurances that if something happened, I could get out quickly. And I was informed that priority would be given to Japanese citizens. So I asked my wife to come because she's a Japanese citizen. But as an ultra precautionary measure, I spoke to an operator in Hong Kong and reached a tentative agreement that I would pay them X thousand US dollars to get me out if need be. Now, I'm fully aware of who that operator is. They're a client. I didn't have to ask many questions. But if I was not working in this business, and if I was simply an individual booking a flight, what would I actually be looking at? And I got a list of questions which are all very familiar, but would I actually be given this information? Who is the charter broker? Do they have a license to be in business? Who is the operator? Who's the manager? Who actually ultimately owns the aircraft? What permits do they have? What traffic rights do they have? Can I see the ownership documents? What is the aircraft registration number? What was the manufacturer, the type, the serial number? When was it built? Who maintains the aircraft? What insurance is available? If you ever want to know what insurance is available, don't ask for an insurance certificate. Ask for the policy. Are you allowed to see the policy? Maybe, maybe not. But that's what I would be doing. Now, I return to my example of the app, and I'm not very familiar with these apps, but I took a flight to New York in May. Unfortunately, I had to fly via Vancouver. It's no offense to Canadians, it's just I would rather a direct flight. But in the transit lounge, this American guy showed me this great app. And we went onto this app, and he showed the process for booking what was effectively a dead-end flight. The aircraft was moving between two cities in the United States, but it didn't have any people on board. So we looked at this, and we did this sort of dummy booking of this flight, and it came up with all these wonderful glossy pictures of, the lounge, the aircraft, and I said, well, can you zoom in on that? Because I'm really interested in the registration number. So we looked in on that, and up comes the registration number. It's confirmed for this particular flight. And I said, well, out of curiosity, let's actually look at this registration number. So we're sitting in the lounge. It's like 2 o'clock in the morning, and we do this search. This aircraft belonged to a Middle East oil corporation, completely different registration. It's based in the Middle East. The aircraft never flies to the States. So there's something going on there. And, if you're just Joe Bloggs punter who can afford to fly on these flights, it's not very reassuring, is it? Now, what some commentators say is that as a charter customer, whether you're a business or otherwise, is that you should contact national aviation authorities. I kind of love and hate aviation authorities. I battle against them all the time. They're not as easy as they used to be in this particular region. Really, if you call up the Hong Kong CAD or CAS in Singapore or another authority in this region as a customer, are they actually going to know the difference between private and public transportation? Are they actually going to be able to give you the information that you need to give you the reassurance that that flight is kosher? What about owners and managers? And I'm getting on to really my last slide here. What are you doing? What are the owners and the managers and the operators doing to ensure that you know who the customer is? Because we've come across maybe 10 or 11 situations in the last 2 years where people have said, where things have gone wrong, they've said, we didn't know they were like that. We didn't know. And you go, well, so what due diligence did you do? And, the due diligence is not that good. It's not that good, and it needs to improve because we're all in this together. And I'm ending my presentation with this simple phrase. If you see something, you have to report it. You have to do something about it. And a lot of people say that. A lot of people say they will do it, but they don't do it. And so an action point is that we are all going to report. But you need to take legal advice on how exactly you do that. Otherwise, you could face a defamation charge or something else. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoyed it.